What happens when a father says, "God told me," and the son is on the receiving end?
There is not one decision in this church today that came out of deliberation. It's thus saith.
This is not a parable, nor is it fiction. It is the real unfolding drama inside one of Africa's largest Pentecostal movements, Living Faith Church, also known as Winners Chapel International. At the center of it all is Bishop David Oyedepo, the revered founder and presiding bishop of the ministry, a man known globally for his firebrand preaching, audacious faith, and structure-driven church model. But right beside him, until recently, stood a man many regarded not only as his most loyal deputy, but also as his spiritual firstborn, Bishop David Abioye. For over 3 decades, Bishop Abioye served faithfully as vice president of the church. He was the calm voice in the background, the seasoned general, the steady figure many saw as next in line should anything ever happen to Oyedepo himself. But everything changed in October 2024, when Bishop Oyedepo turned 70 and the ministry quietly implemented its retirement policy.
This is our admission policy, 1998.
Bishop Abioye was retired. He did not apply for an extension. He did not attend Shiloh 2024. He went silent until May 2025, when he re-emerged as the founder of a new ministry.
The name Living Word Conquerors Global Assembly.
Living Word Conquerors Global Assembly. Now, just a month later, a church memo dated June 2, 2025 has emerged, reportedly signed by Church Secretary Abui and carrying the weight of Bishop Oyedepo's authority. The memo subtly bans living faith pastors from attending any programs hosted by retired or former pastors of the commission, including, as many now interpret, Abioye. What's more, Oyedepo has now come out to clarify, it was God's instruction.
There is not one decision in this church today that came out of deliberation. It's thus saith.
The controversial memo. Let's break down this now viral memo that has rocked the living faith community. Date: June 2, 2025. Signed by Abui. Office: Church Secretary. The subject was subtle, memo on church programs. But the content? Anything but ordinary. Here are the key takeaways. 1. Winners Chapel pastors are instructed to prioritize internal church programs over any other external invitations or events. 2. Programs organized by sons and daughters of the prophet, affiliate ministries, or retired, resigned, or disengaged pastors are now considered secondary to official living faith programs. 3. Any pastor intending to attend such external programs must now receive clearance from headquarters. 4. The stated objective? To prevent loss of focus, avoid compromise, and ensure that the flock of Christ in our care are properly nurtured. Now, while no individual names were explicitly mentioned, the timing of the memo, just weeks after Bishop Abioye publicly launched his new ministry and began hosting public programs, makes the intended target clear. Let's not forget, Bishop Abioye is not just any ex-staff. He was the former vice president, a senior bishop, and one of the most visible faces of Winners Chapel for over 30 years. His move to establish Living Word Conquerors is still fresh, and the new ministry is already gaining momentum. So when a memo drops that subtly restricts pastors from attending any meetings hosted by retired pastors or sons of the prophet, many saw it as a direct response to Abioye's rising influence. Some even say this is a spiritual gag order, an institutional firewall, and a veiled message to ensure no more pastors or members cross over. Oyedepo's defense: IT was God's instruction. As the memo began circulating and questions began to rise online and offline, Bishop David Oyedepo himself stepped in to clarify the motive behind the policy. According to reliable sources, Bishop Oyedepo publicly stated that every decision made in the church is born out of divine instruction.
There is not one decision in this church today that came out of deliberation. It's thus saith.
He added that nothing happens at the leadership level of the church without God's leading and scriptural conviction. In other words, this was not personal. It was not an act of insecurity. It was, in Oyedepo's words, God's will. But here's where the situation becomes complicated, and let's take a moment to reflect. If it was indeed God's instruction, what was God trying to prevent? Was God warning Oyedepo about potential disloyalty? Was God revealing that Abioye's new platform could become a distraction to the vision of Living Faith Church? Or could this be a human decision cloaked in divine language? That's the big question now tearing through both supporters and critics of the memo. Critics argue, if there's no issue between Oyedepo and Abioye, why the need for this kind of memo at all? Supporters counter, it's about protecting the altar, preserving the spiritual DNA of the ministry, and ensuring that no one breaks the flow. But there's a deeper emotional layer beneath this memo that cannot be ignored. We must remember, Bishop Abioye didn't leave in rebellion. He didn't start attacking Living Faith Church. He didn't even speak out after retirement. He simply launched quietly, began his assignment, and started doing what he's always done: preach, teach, lead, and bless lives. So, why now the sudden urge to place restrictions? Was this an act of spiritual safeguarding, or a strategic move to prevent pastoral drift? Let's go further. When Bishop Oyedepo says, "It was God's instruction," does that completely shield the decision from scrutiny? We know that leaders, spiritual or political, can sometimes mix institutional preservation with divine inspiration. So, in this case, is this a genuine leading from God? A defensive reaction to a potential rival? Or a preemptive move to stop another wave of pastoral departures? Because let's face it, Bishop Abioye is not just another name. He has deep loyalty among the older pastors. He commands respect across the church network. And for some members, he was their spiritual father even more than Bishop Oyedepo. So this memo, backed by the phrase "God said," raises more questions than answers. Critical reflection. Let's pause and take a balanced look at what's happening here. On one hand, Bishop Oyedepo is known for his no-nonsense leadership. He has built a global ministry that spans over 100 countries, with thousands of pastors under him. To maintain that kind of structure, discipline, and clarity are required. So it makes sense that he would want to avoid anything that causes confusion, distraction, or competing loyalties within the fold. But on the other hand, there is the Abioye factor. He is not a man who fought for position. He didn't resist retirement. He didn't stir division. Yet, now that he has stepped into a fresh assignment, it appears that his every move is being scrutinized and countered. This brings up a tough question. When a spiritual son launches his own assignment in peace, should the father restrict others from supporting him? It's also important to note that in the African Pentecostal space, phrases like "God told me" carry enormous weight. They often end arguments. They silence critics. They remove room for human logic. But should they? Because if "God said" becomes the default answer to every difficult decision, it can sometimes shield leaders from accountability, even when emotions or fear might be at play. In this situation, Oyedepo's statement adds finality, but also ignites controversy. And so, we are left with two realities. 1. The memo has been issued. 2. The justification is spiritual. But the interpretation? That's now in the hands of the people. What do you think? Was this spiritual wisdom or strategic insulation? So far, in this unfolding drama between Bishop David Oyedepo and his longtime deputy Bishop David Abioye, one voice has been noticeably silent. Bishop Abioye himself. Despite the release of the June 2, 2025 memo barring Living Faith Church pastors from attending his programs, and the ensuing media buzz, Abioye has not made any public statement about the issue. No fiery rebuttal, no veiled Facebook post, not even a sermon quote addressing the controversy. Instead, what has he done? He has continued building. Yes, he has remained focused on growing his new assignment, Living Word Conquerors Global Assembly, a ministry that, within a few months of launch, has already attracted widespread attention, not because of its music, branding, or marketing, but because of who Abioye is. To understand public perception, we must first understand the man behind the name. For over 30 years, Bishop David Abioye served with integrity, submission, and loyalty. He was never known for drama, never linked to power tussles. He wasn't flashy. He was prayerful, consistent, calm, and deeply respected by the church rank and file. In fact, some people still find it hard to believe that he actually left. That's how at home he was in the Living Faith system. So when he retired quietly in October 2024 and then reappeared with a fresh ministry in May 2025, most people didn't see it as rebellion. They saw it as obedience to a higher divine calling. Now, with this memo surfacing and Oyedepo publicly defending it as God's instruction, people are beginning to ask, is this restriction even necessary? What exactly is Abioye being punished or protected from? Why should pastors need clearance to attend a spiritual father's program? These questions are being whispered in corners of churches, asked in online Christian forums, and debated in WhatsApp groups of former pastors and faithful members alike. To many, Bishop Abioye remains a symbol of humility, maturity, and grace. He hasn't thrown shade at his former mentor. He hasn't made cryptic social media jabs. He hasn't built his ministry on bitterness. Instead, he continues to hold firm to what he believes God called him to do, without seeking revenge or validation. And it is that composure, that quiet strength, that is now winning hearts and causing Living Faith Church members to reflect deeply on what exactly is playing out. In fact, to many observers, this silence is louder than 1,000 sermons. Because while one side has issued a memo and defended it, the other has chosen to walk in grace. And in the minds of many, that speaks volumes. Interpreting the divine claim. Now let's turn to perhaps the most spiritually sensitive part of this saga. Bishop Oyedepo's declaration that the decision to ban pastors from attending Abioye's programs was God's instruction. This one line has opened up a theological can of worms. Let's break it down. First, what does it mean when a leader says, "God said"? In Pentecostal Christianity, especially within African charismatic circles, "God said" carries incredible authority. It is often the final word. It ends debates. It seals decisions. It discourages questioning. But here's the challenge. How do you test what God really said? Let's explore 3 major tensions this divine claim has triggered. Can God's voice be used to shut doors to former sons? If indeed God instructed that pastors should not attend Abioye's programs, then we must ask, is God against the programs of a man who served faithfully for 30 years? Is God telling the father to isolate the son, or protect his house? Is this God's way of drawing boundaries, or is it man's way of preserving influence? In the Bible, we see Paul and Barnabas separate over disagreement, but both continued serving God and building the kingdom. Their split wasn't painted as rebellion. It was seen as a different direction. Could that be the case here? Did God actually instruct Oyedepo to stop his pastors from fellowshipping with Abioye? Or is this a protective policy framed as a prophetic one? Is this protection or control? Many have interpreted the memo as a form of pastoral control, an attempt to keep people in line, especially at a time when loyalty is being tested. Think about it. Bishop Abioye is not just any preacher. His style, tone, and even theology mirror that of Winners Chapel. So if he begins to gather momentum, he could naturally attract both pastors and members who are still very loyal to him. That's not necessarily rebellion, that's just relational gravity. So now, some wonder, is this memo a spiritual instruction, or a form of preemptive insulation? In other words, is this God telling the house to guard its oil, or man trying to protect his legacy? Because the language of the memo is clear: loss of focus, compromise, and flock protection. But those terms can mean many things depending on who is reading. And that's the danger of using spiritual authority to make sensitive institutional decisions. It often blurs the line between divine instruction and emotional reaction. What happens when spiritual authority and human emotion mix? Let's be honest, spiritual leaders are human. Even the best of them can sometimes feel threatened, wounded, or protective of what they've built. It's natural. It's human. But when that natural instinct is covered with the phrase "God said," we risk turning emotion into doctrine. Now, let's be fair. Bishop Oyedepo has a long track record of divine accuracy and spiritual discipline. His ministry has produced millions of testimonies. He is not a man known for erratic decisions. But even that doesn't mean every administrative policy is always free of sentiment. In fact, the most spiritually mature leaders are those who can say, "This is my judgment," not necessarily a word from God. So when he says "God told me," the public begins to ask, is this really about divine insight or pastoral insecurity? Is this about the church's purity or the leadership's authority? Can God be invoked to validate every difficult decision? At the end of the day, this is not just a battle of memo versus silence. It's a moment that calls for deep discernment. We must be careful not to idolize men or demonize them, but rather to test every spirit, weigh every instruction, and remember, even spiritual giants are still humans walking by grace. So when Oyedepo says God instructed us, we must ask respectfully, what kind of God would cut off a faithful son without rebellion? What message does this send to future leaders who serve with loyalty? And most of all, can this be a kingdom move if it divides the kingdom? Impact on the body of Christ. In every unfolding church issue, especially when it involves respected leaders, the ripple effects go far beyond the men involved. This isn't just about Bishop David Oyedepo or Bishop David Abioye anymore. It's about how the body of Christ interprets, reacts, and evolves in the face of internal conflict. Let's take a deep look at how this affects key groups in the Christian landscape. 1. For pastors. Obedience versus honor. For many living faith church pastors, this memo has placed them in a spiritual dilemma. On one side, they have institutional obedience, clear instructions from the headquarters demanding loyalty, structure, and alignment. On the other side, they have spiritual honor, years of being mentored, trained, and fathered by Bishop David Abioye. It's like asking a son to choose between the house that raised him and the house that commands him. What happens when a pastor owes his rise in ministry to Bishop Abioye's mentorship, yet is now being told not to associate with him? What does that do to loyalty, gratitude, and spiritual fatherhood? Some pastors may obey in public, but their hearts remain torn in private. Some may quietly distance themselves from both camps, avoiding involvement altogether. Others may begin to question the balance between corporate loyalty and divine relationships. And that, right there, is where damage begins to spread. Because when spiritual fathers are placed on opposite sides, sons become casualties. 2. For church members. Confusion and division. The members, oh yes, the members, are watching too. And let's be clear, the average churchgoer is not spiritually blind. They see the body language. They notice the subtle tensions. They hear the silence from Abioye and the strong defense from Oyedepo. They observe which pastors no longer mention the other name. And the result? Confusion, division, and eventually, exit. Some loyalists to Bishop Abioye may quietly shift allegiance, especially if they feel the treatment is unfair. Others may stay in Winners Chapel but carry questions in their hearts that never get answered. Still others may become disillusioned altogether, wondering how two of Nigeria's most respected spiritual leaders could go separate ways without clarity or peace. Let's not forget that church members are humans too, with emotions, memories, and loyalties. They've seen both bishops on the same stage, preaching the same word, casting the same vision. And now, a line has been drawn. The body of Christ bleeds, not from war, but from confusion. 3. For Bishop Oyedepo's legacy. Fuel for succession debates. Finally, let's talk about the legacy impact. Bishop Oyedepo is no ordinary leader. His global influence, his decades of impact, and the sheer magnitude of Winners Chapel make his every move monumental. But let's be honest, the retirement of Bishop Abioye, his longtime right-hand man, followed by this restriction memo, has reignited the debate about succession. Many believe that Abioye's peaceful removal was part of a broader transition plan for Oyedepo's biological son, David Oyedepo Jr. Though the senior bishop denied any nepotism, the optics still raise eyebrows. Now that the one man who many thought would naturally take over has launched his own ministry, the questions only grow louder. Was Abioye quietly pushed out to make room for the bloodline? Did Oyedepo underestimate the impact Abioye's exit would have? And is this ban a way to secure loyalty around a new center of authority? These are not accusations. They are reflections happening in the minds of thousands. Because succession in ministry is one of the most delicate transitions in any spiritual movement. And when it's not handled transparently, it leads to splinters, suspicions, and sometimes, schisms. And Bishop Oyedepo, a man known for structure and foresight, may now be facing the unintended consequence of control over connection. Let's recap this sobering chain of events. A faithful deputy, Bishop David Abioye, retires quietly in October 2024 after 30-plus years of service. He declines to extend his tenure, skips Shiloh 2024, and spends time seeking God. 6 months later, he launches a new ministry, Living Word Conquerors Global Assembly. And then, on June 2, 2025, a memo emerges from the Winners Chapel headquarters. That memo prohibits pastors from attending his programs without clearance, calling them secondary and potentially causing compromise. Bishop Oyedepo then publicly says, "This is God's instruction." Meanwhile, Bishop Abioye remains publicly silent, yet continues to rise. And now, the public is watching, and the body of Christ is reacting. So what are we to make of all this? Was the memo a genuine act of divine obedience, or a calculated form of protection? Is this truly about kingdom order, or a reaction to growing influence outside the house? Should former spiritual sons be honored or isolated when they launch out? And when God is invoked in church policy, Who confirms the voice? These are not small questions. They cut to the core of church leadership, succession, spiritual authority, and the health of the body. We are not here to take sides, but to invite deep thinking. Because one thing is clear. This is no longer about two men. It's about the kingdom. So now, we turn the mic to you. What do you think? Is Bishop Oyedepo right in enforcing this restriction? Or is this a fear-driven response to a growing ministry outside the fold? Should pastors be allowed to honor their former spiritual fathers, even after new beginnings? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have a respectful, honest conversation about what this means for the future of church leadership and the unity of Christ's body. Because at the end of the day, unity is greater than rivalry, and obedience is better than image. May God lead His church with truth, with grace, and with peace.